thank you all for coming. We don't have a whole lot of time this evening, so I'm really going to just kind of jump into the presentation. It's one of those where I'm not sure if I maybe put together too many slides, so I really want to try to manage time wisely given that we don't have a whole lot of time. These types of presentations often spark some questions, and so if we can have a few minutes at the end as well, if there's any follow-up questions, it'd be nice to be able to do that also. So the title, How to Manage Your Child's Anger and Help Them Regain Control. I guess I will say briefly, I'm the assistant director at the Penn State Psychological Clinic. I've been there about 14 years, and in our capacity, we have a community mental health clinic, and also it's the principal training site for a PhD clinical psychology program. So we have this unique blend of academia, but also a community mental health program housed in our psychology department. And part of that community mental health program has been a lot of involvement over the past 25 years in the community, involved in community supports, base service unit, mental health, intellectual disability, substance use. So we have a lot of interaction with a lot of various agencies, and it's how we became involved in this project and the grant as well. So we're really excited to be able to put on some of these trainings. So this particular topic, actually I put it together really quickly, and I remember I sent it off to Nikki, and I thought, wow, that's pretty tough to kind of conceptualize that we manage our children's anger in some particular way, or we manage affect in some particular way. So actually I went ahead and I changed the title. How to anticipate and support and respond to dysregulated emotions in children, and helping to gain control, because I conceptualize this in a dynamic process, in terms of an interpersonal process between people, and that it's not really something that we fix in children, and that we really need to see that there's a variety of influences, there's a variety of perspectives, we'll talk about it tonight, in terms of what causes some of these dysregulatory patterns. And also there's a variety of influences that can actually provide change as well. So tonight, we're going to be talking about, obviously, dysregulation in a broad sense. We're going to conceptualize where dysregulation comes from. We are going to be emphasizing on the role of the caregiver, which I would imagine includes most of the individuals in this room, or else you probably couldn't be here. And then have some time for Q&A. So Jonathan, who is 8, yelled downstairs in the morning that he wanted pancakes for breakfast. His mother said that she would make him some. When he came down, his younger sister was already eating pancakes, and Jonathan became irate. His mother insisted that she would make more for him, but it was too late. He was kicking chairs, crying uncontrollably, and threatening his sister. His mother, already infuriated herself, yelled at him to calm down and tried to get him back to his room. He refused and ran from her. She threatened him with a variety of consequences, and this episode lasted approximately 45 minutes before he was able to calm down and get ready for school. Just have 2. Jonathan and Samantha, who was 16, just found out that her best friend was moving away. For the next several days, her parents found her sobbing uncontrollably in her room. She refused to eat, would not talk to her parents, and barely made it to school. Her parents tried to reason with her, telling her that she had other friends, but she told them that they did not understand, and continued sobbing and yelling at them to leave her alone. So what is emotional dysregulation? In essence, it's a lack of self-control. Just so folks know, I didn't get this ahead of time, and we could have made copies and had copies available. I will make this presentation available to anyone afterwards. We'll have some centralized way of accessing it, so in case you're wondering. A lack of self-control and poor modulation. We think in terms of emotional regulation, dysregulation, but really it leads and it interplays so much so with cognitions, the way we think and the way we behave, and our general mood. So Samantha was an example of internalizing types of dysregulation. Intense affect, often internalized. We often see this in terms of depression, anxiety-related problems. It's often harder to identify. Parents typically are very familiar with a child who is a dysregulated internalizer. Schools, a lot of times, are not that familiar with that child because they typically fly under the radar. Again, emotions are harder for us to measure. Oops. However, with Jonathan, we see and hear from Jonathan everywhere, right? The externalizers are the ones who often get our attention. And they have a difficulty with regulating their emotion and often having tantrums, breakdowns, hostility, irritability, aggression. And we see these often in an external manner. You can see the interplay with emotional dysregulation and behaviors then as well. So where does this come from? What contributes to emotional dysregulation? And as with many areas, if we're talking about depression, if we were talking about a thought disturbance, ADHD, well, why? Why does a child have that? Why does a child experience these types of symptoms, these problems? And we know now that it's not just one particular area. It's a multifaceted process. So it comes from the child. It comes from their interactions with others. It comes from the broader socio-political climate, the quality of schools, their socioeconomic status. But with what we're going to be talking about today in terms of emotional dysregulation, we're talking about what are the factors that contribute to either helping and supporting or potentially facilitating more dysregulation, actually reinforcing patterns that we don't want to see. So part of that is the child. Part of that is the quality of strategies that we're employing. It's what we're doing working, and what types of strategies do we employ. And we'll go through those specifically. And then the last that we talked about that we'll be focusing on a little bit more heavily are caregiver contributions. Meaning, what are you bringing to the table specifically that actually provides to this dynamic? Provides in ways that actually serve to reinforce, see the behavior more frequently, the same behavior that we're pulling our hair out. How could I be contributing to this? I'm doing everything in my power to stop it. And some of those things are likely very effective and maybe very helpful, but some of the things, because we don't have objectivity so often in these situations, that we're not seeing that we're unwittingly contributing to them in many ways. So at the child level, what are some of these variables that we see? I mean, obviously, we all come out hardwired in particular ways. When I say hardwired, not that it's such a definitive, finite piece, but we all have a variety of neural pathways, ways in which we respond to the world, our own DNA, what was passed on to us, our family histories, and that comes to the individual. We all have our predispositions to certain characteristics. With children who have emotional dysregulation, we do see a lot of what we call frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, executive functioning, just really fancy ways of identifying, in some ways ADHD-related types of challenges, but individuals who experience a lot of difficulty with impulsivity, judgment, reasoning, planning. When you experience those types of difficulties, information that's hard to process, it's easy to get overwhelmed, overloaded, and you can have a dysregulated event. The other piece that's part of, the child that we see is temperament. In terms of, we often think of this in terms of attachment styles, how easy an individual is to engage. We see it we see early on interpersonal styles, temperament styles in infants that's highly predictive of their future relationship quality, risk for potential social, emotional, and behavioral problems. So we see a lot, and those of us with children, we know that kids come out with certain personality types, and a lot of those remain relatively stable, that we see that, wow, they've been that way since 1, 2, 3, and beyond. Another variable that we see at the individual level is cognitive flexibility. How flexible is the child? How do they navigate in their environment, process information, and do they see the nuance? Are they able to see multiple perspectives in the information that they take in? Individual children who have more propensity for cognitive flexibility tend to manage and regulate their emotions and behaviors more effectively. And then we see obviously this is related to dysregulation, impulsivity. An individual's ability to inhibit their impulses, delay gratification, their propensity for engaging in sensation-seeking behavior. That's a risk factor for many types of problems, including dysregulation, and just general frustration tolerance. An individual's ability to kind of take on and cope with stressors in their environment. And I'll just say one more thing on this. This is where, at the individual child level, that we highlight the need that you have to individually tailor to every child. And those in the room who have more than one child, you know this firsthand, that what worked for one child is not necessarily working for the next. So we talk about consistency in parenting in a home, but that does not necessarily mean that how that consistency plays out really works collectively for children within the home. So there's a lot of individual tailoring that happens. These types of consequences were not effective with this particular child, but work really, really well here. So again, and that's why we get into our caregiver role, because how flexible are we to realize that I have to change, I have to alter the way in which I'm interacting if I'm going to work with this child in a different way, because it worked over here. Now I'm realizing that those tools, those interventions, that particular skill set no longer works. So the strategies. Now, in a presentation like this, this is what folks typically come to want to really spend a lot of time with, and we have more in the series that really focus on targeted intervention for supporting appropriate behaviors, and so I am going to kind of go through these rather quickly. A lot of these strategies cut across multiple settings. A lot of my interest is actually working with direct care providers in community settings, working with really high needs individuals. Basically, my clients are often the staff members who are treating some of the more difficult, behaviorally disrupted individuals, impaired individuals. And obviously I get really energized about the clients that they serve, but I'm really energized by the staff trying to help and support them to be able to create these more effective interventions. Same stuff that we see in the parenting literature. It's actually the same stuff that we see in psychotherapy literature. What works interpersonally? What works in helping someone and supporting someone? And what are these strategies? But with respect to significant emotional dysregulation, how do I support this individual? How do I help them gain control? Basically, it's often our first point of access, our first intervention that we try. It's very behaviorally oriented. Now, when we get into talking about you and your contribution, it's much more of a dynamic process, right? It's much more of an insight process. What am I contributing? But when we're talking about what works and I really would like to see this particular behavior change, we need behaviorally oriented interventions. And in doing that, we need a good assessment process, meaning what is the behavior? Can I operationalize it? Can I identify a target behavior? A tantrum in the store, spinning on the floor, screaming, kicking food off shelves. There's my behavior. That's it. That's what I'm talking about. Like, okay, so that's a target behavior. What we would think about is what happens before. They started yelling and screaming before they went onto the floor. Well, let's back up a little bit more. You know, what happened before that? My guess is that you weren't just pushing the shopping cart down and all of a sudden yelling began and they landed on the floor. No, they wanted X, Y, and Z. I said no, we needed to go. They were really upset, and it just escalated from there. So what we begin to look at with the A in the ABCs is what we call antecedents. What happened before? What contributed to actually this behavior occurring? And then with C is basically we're interested in what happened immediately after. What happened after you saw that they were becoming upset, they were yelling? What happened after they went to the floor, kicking things off the shelf? What did you do? And so what we see is that that's a consequence. Not a consequence necessarily as in a, I'm taking this from you consequence, meaning that that is a resulting behavior that occurred. And what we begin to see is what effect does that have on then the behavior occurring more afterwards. Now it's a very, very oversimplified version, but in behaviorally oriented parent management training that we engage in, we really look at the broad spectrum of all these different target behaviors and all the different types of antecedents, things that happened before, that increase the likelihood of the behavior occurring, and then also to what happens afterwards. Are we implementing things that actually decrease the behavior or potentially facilitate more the likelihood of the behavior? Very, very simple, but really, really difficult to implement. But many of these strategies are behaviorally oriented. Necessary, but insufficient. You have to be able to respond in a behaviorally oriented way, but it doesn't get you home. So in addition to that, also very behaviorally oriented types of interventions, we think about incentives prior to punishment. Very quick when we're upset and we're angry ourselves. I'm taking this away, you're not going to get that. Way to go, now you've lost X, Y, and Z. And in those moments when we're already actually dysregulated, we lose our ability to think about creative incentives for kids. Let's actually work together during a period of calm and let's try to build this together. And if we can have tantrum-free days for this much time, then let's actually look to have this happen, where you'd be able to receive this particular reward or receive this incentive. Anticipating problems before they emerge. So often we don't think about meaningful consequences to specific behaviors, to specific outbursts. Meaning that if this is going to happen and I take something away or I introduce something as a reward, is that meaningful? Is it meaningful to that child? Is that going to be something that they're interested in? With my particular kids, I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. Charts, behavior charts on their fridge. Total thumbs up. He still today, my 10-year-old's like, you know, if we're doing checks on things, whatever it might be. It could be taking out the trash, and or it could be, you know, sleeping in his own bed. He's just so invested in that chart. How many more do I need until I get that? Oh my gosh, I have 3 more. If I get 3 more, I'm so excited. My daughter is like, yeah, whatever. Chart, you know, look, but you could get 4 more of these. Great. You know, so we had to create a totally different incentive system because it wasn't meaningful to her. It didn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, then it's not something that she's likely going to develop intrinsic motivation to change. Promoting emotional control. We often forget that. Pointing out those moments where our children actually, you just ran into a stressor right there, and that was really difficult. And I saw you begin to get, and then what happened is you pulled back, you went over, you sat on the couch, and you turned the TV on, or you sat down and began to pet the cat. And sometimes we forget to really highlight those moments that you just displayed emotional control. Because again, we're not managing emotions. Emotions are a wonderful thing, they're complex, they make us who we are. We should be promoting a variety of strong, intense emotions. But there's a difference between that and dysregulation. Dysregulation is about not being able to control emotions. And we often forget that. Sometimes when our kids are crying and we don't necessarily understand, we immediately interpret that as dysregulation. What are you crying for? What's going on? What's your problem? But that's not necessarily dysregulation, they're just crying about something. But maybe based on our interaction that we just had, we think that they're actually doing it for what we call instrumental purposes, right? They're just trying to maybe get X, Y, and Z and do this and get that. So all of a sudden I'm now in this pattern where I'm and we'll get to that, I'm negatively attributing what the behavior is. So I'm already attributing some dysregulation, some manipulation, and we're already off to a really bad interaction pattern. So we have to appreciate our own contributions. Good. Good time, too. So in a lot of my work with direct care staff, and with parent work, so I just don't end up doing as much of it as I do a lot more with working with direct care staff. We're often measuring for these things. We're often giving them questionnaires to help them kind of get some perspective on how they're attributing, how they're interpreting what's happening with the individuals that they're serving. Same thing with parents, and I've given some of these measures that we've developed for direct care staff to parents in my work as well. And we'll go through these individually, but attribution and appraisal, how we interpret the events that are happening in front of us. We see a behavior, what do we make of it? Why is it occurring? What's our sense of modeling? Talk about that more specifically. Our degree of self-efficacy. How good are we at this? How confident am I? Burnout and exhaustion, consistency across caregivers, and our ability to create a united front. All these are critical caregiver variables that we often overlook. We think about, what do I need to do with them? What do I need to do with this child to create a different environment, to give them different emotional expression, to help them regain control? And so often we don't think about, actually, we have to take that mirror off of the child and onto ourselves. Take a look at our environment, what's going on, what's happening. If it's a two-parent household, are we on the same page? Do we approach these types of things differently? Do we even see the same problem? Or do we see it in the same way? So we conceptualize this from a sense of challenging behavior and how we respond. We typically have some type of attribution, an interpretation of what we see with respect to the challenging behavior, in this case, emotional dysregulation. We experience emotions from that. We become frustrated, upset, irritated, depressed, hopeless. And then the outcome, meaning what ends up happening. Are we seeing more or less of the behavior? Do we see more or less control? And along the way, negative attribution increases our chances of burnout. The more we are attributing negative interpretations to behaviors, and we'll talk about what those mean, the more we actually feel stress, the more we actually are likely to feel burnout, and definitely, most definitely, the less effective we are at supporting our children and helping our children regain control of their own emotions. And we see it then as a result of the outcomes are not changing. And then we're more frustrated and the cycle continues. I'm not seeing any change, they're not changing, I've tried everything, nothing's working, and it's difficult. Oops. So with these kinds of attributions, what does it mean? What does it look like? So it's, why do they behave this way? Why are they struggling emotionally this way? Now, I won't ask anyone in this room if they've ever interpreted their child's behaviors in any of these particular ways. But I would imagine if it did, quite a few hands would go up. But I would ask you, if you've ever had that experience, how are you feeling in that moment? Are you feeling particularly confident, calm, relaxed, prepared, annoyed? So if we were to interpret when we run what we call functional behavioral assessments, where we actually are doing observations with individuals trying to identify target behaviors. We might do this when we're opening up an individual case. So we're basically putting together some type of behavior plan. What we're trying to do is develop some accurate attributions, accurate antecedents to behaviors to help people begin to understand that, okay, this is probably why this individual is engaging in some of these behaviors. And this is just a few of some of what we often come up with, that individuals, children, and the adults too, might be engaging in that emotional dysregulation, aggressive behavior, verbal aggression, whatever it might be that we're identifying as the target behavior. As task avoidance, they don't like what they're doing, they want to get away from it. They have a preferred activity, so they're trying to get to that. They want to escape. They have a disability, and this is an expression of their particular disability in some way, whether it's a communication disability, intellectual disability, ADHD. They're experiencing significant discomfort. Sensory input, integration problems, too much stimuli. They're having attention problems. It's hard for them to remain focused, concentrate, so they're distracted. So when we have that kind of an interpretation of a behavior that we might be seeing, which it might even be somebody who's just crying uncontrollably, really upset, hitting their fist against something, might we feel different? Might we actually sense something a little bit differently because we are interpreting what is happening a little bit differently? And I think that there's a lot of literature and science that points out that more accurate attributions result in fewer negative emotional reactions, obviously fewer negative attributions, and more effective interventions on the part of parents, on the part of direct care staff, in a variety of settings. Additional attributions that really matter are how we interpret what's happening with this behavior. In essence, what's the prognosis of this? And when we look in terms of, well, let me go to the second two here. So, do we see it as this kind of permanent process? This is never going to change. It's just never going to change. He or she, they're always going to be that way. There's just nothing anybody's ever going to be able to do. Versus, this really can be temporary. If we alter things, provide supports in different ways, and change what we're doing, this really could be a temporary process. They might experience some of these problems for an extended period of time, but when we think about these new target behaviors that we've identified that we really want to see with respect to emotional dysregulation, we really think that we could see some changes, some improvements, and that feels more temporary. So you can begin to see this dynamic in terms of our own interpretation of what it means. Controllable, uncontrollable. We hear this all the time in mental health settings. Is it behavioral or is it mental health? Like, it's just the dumbest dichotomy I've ever heard in my life. As if like, oh, if it's mental health, they don't have control whatsoever, right? It's some biological condition, but if it's behavioral, they have full control and they're doing it just because they want to annoy people. And you see how it's so tied to negative attributions, right? Is it a mental health problem or is it just behavioral? It's absurd to me. I mean, mental health problems are behaviorally oriented problems. I just never understood that, other than it gives people a way to say it's controllable or uncontrollable. But then that's assuming that mental health problems are uncontrollable, which I don't believe that either. But that degree of permanence, how unyielding this is, completely puts us in a biased perspective. It's an inflexible appreciation for what's happening. The internal-external is more of the etiology, meaning where does this come from? It's bad seed. It's them. They were born this way. They were just that way. It does create a little bit of a biased interpretation of things. We're going to feel a little bit more sense of permanence, a little bit more sense of uncontrollability. But, yes, they came out with a host of challenges. There's no doubt. This child could live in any home, and they're going to create some challenges for that family. All right, I get that. But that's only a part of the internal piece. Obviously, external influences really matter as well. So it's never, most of these, not all of these, are false dichotomies. We have to look at this. We can't be standing in a room in our home and getting upset at a child for behavioral, emotional dysregulation and not have a pretty accurate sense of how do we manage this ourselves. How regulated are we? How do we model coping with stress? How do we model the expression of intense emotions? Do we model crying as a healthy and adaptive way of expressing strong emotions? What are the messages that we give in relationship to that? So we really have to think about how we model, not just in what we show emotionally, but how we manage those things as well. Self-efficacy is actually gaining a lot of attention in terms of parental literature and direct care staff literature, meaning that when I'm feeling more effective at what I do, lots begins to change. My emotional reactions change, my attributions change to more positive, and my behaviors change, and subsequently the behaviors that I'm attempting to have an impact on, i.e. my child's, my client, change as well. All through this idea that I'm more effective at what I'm doing. I have more confidence. I have more optimism. Now there's a lot of factors that play into that. Quality of supports, quality of training, information, financial status, actually. Lots of different things contribute to positive self-efficacy. But one of the biggest we know is that I feel like I can adequately predict what's going to happen with a reasonable degree of accuracy. You know, that's big for when we go out, when we get home from school, when this is going to happen. That I can predict how things are going to go, accurately so. Not necessarily predict that it's going to be hell. Not in that particular way, although sometimes we do that as well. So our emotional reactions in the moment actually facilitate this ABC process. So we have an intense emotional reaction in front of us. It's in the store. I want this. No, you can't have it. I want it. And it just goes from there. And we often have this approach avoidance piece. It's either stop it. I'm going to try to either verbally, possibly physically, get you to stop, so we're approaching, or I'm not dealing with this. And so it's driven by our emotional reactions because we're embarrassed, we're feeling ashamed, we're angry, we're upset, we're feeling helpless. So our emotional reactions are driving this sense of I need to come in and do something, which is often very ineffective, or I need to just, I'm done. We talk a lot about planned ignoring in terms of behavioral interventions. And so a lot of parents and staff I've worked with, hey, planned ignoring, I'm just gonna ignore, right? And maybe, sure, sometimes planned ignoring can be really, really effective, right? When the target behavior is fully driven by attention, and there's not a danger to anyone else, or others, it's however we're operationalizing it, and attention really drives it, and you want to pull back attention in that particular moment and see what happens. That behavior goes down, then that's great. But it's comical at times, like they're smashing up their room, and you know what? I just did some planned ignoring. Go ahead, do that. And sometimes or something in the store that's very, very chaotic. It's hard to ignore that behavior. So there's a time and a place for some of these particular strategies. But that's our gut level reaction at first, is to approach or avoid. Now, if our gut level reaction was empathy, assistance, nurturance, and support, we might be thinking like, yeah, we're a little too late for that. That's pretty hard to do. But if we found an opportunity where we could employ that, might we get some different results? When Jonathan yelled down and said, I want pancakes, and he came downstairs, and his sister was eating, and he started, how long did that take? I'm sure he didn't come down the stairs, I'm going to hit my sister, I'm so ticked off, he probably came downstairs, and then he saw her. Were there any opportunities for empathy, support, nurturance at any time that might have had an impact on it? I don't know. And then we also have, responses in terms of our emotional reactions: fear, anger, helplessness, and apathy. And that can certainly lead to more experiences of burnout and exhaustion. This is good. So what else to do? And I realize I'm not giving a lot of what to do whens. We'll have probably about 10 minutes at the end if you want to ask some specific questions. Because I really wanted to present a broad perspective of how we understand these types of problems. Because this whole, we have a child who's doing X, Y, and Z, we would never have, you need so much time. These are so complex of issues in terms of how we respond to emotional dysregulation. You really need to be able to look at it from a broad system standpoint, knowing a lot about the individual child and the environment and so many things. And even getting into the specific interventions can be really hard because those often need to be tailored to the type of situation at hand. So, a child with this needs X, Y, and Z. Well, maybe, maybe not. So I try to keep it in more of a broad perspective, that these are general ideas that tend to work best across settings. So if we think about what are some techniques, what are some things that we know that actually cut across multiple different interventions, multiple different perspectives, in terms of parent training, in terms of even therapy, in terms of support for individuals with real challenging behavior. There are some strategies that we see that really does have a place and a role in each of these disciplines. And the first is this idea of an alliance. Do we facilitate and create an alliance with our child? That doesn't mean a friendship. I'm not talking about that. An alliance is an agreement on the goals and tasks at hand. What are we wanting to see happen? Do you like feeling this way? No, I don't like feeling this way. I bet you don't. And these times that you get really, really upset, I bet you feel really sad. Sometimes you're even scared and you even get really angry. I do. So it makes sense that we want to see you feel less of that. Right? To feel better. I would like to. Okay, so what's happening in just that conversation is that we're developing an alliance around a goal. All right, mommy, daddy, whatever, I do too. I want to see that happen too. So let's talk about how do we get from where you are now, to there. Because it does seem like some of the things that we're doing together, when you get upset, it's not working out. So what are some different things? I have some suggestions, I have some thoughts, some ideas, whatever it might be. But if we don't have an alliance, if we don't have that ability to facilitate that communication pattern, this is what we want to see change, and these are the things that we're going to do to get there. It's really hard to make significant changes. The other piece of alliance is what we refer to as the bond, the quality of the relationship, and that facilitates, obviously so, the likelihood of agreement on goals and tasks. The other piece is empathy and validation. How much are we able to create an environment where we take the subjective perspective of the child? And how hard do we work to try to understand what's driving and motivating them? Empathy and validation are not agreement with folks. If I empathize with you, if I validate your experience, I'm not agreeing with you. I'm not siding with you. I'm understanding you. I'm capturing your experience to the best of my ability. So when Jonathan came downstairs and took him aside and said, look, that was a big deal. You were really excited. You came downstairs wanting to see pancakes, wanting to eat pancakes. You were mad at your sister from last night, and there she is eating your pancakes. I get it. You're really ticked off. Now, I don't know. I don't know, Jonathan. I don't know if that would have done any good in that particular situation. But do we try that? Do we attempt to find those moments where we're capturing that experience before we jump in with our interventions, our consequence? Stop it, or X, Y, and Z is going to happen, right? Because we set up the rules, and this is what's going to be. These can be very easy interventions to employ. Lots of, accumulated research tells us parents and caregivers who are able to form an alliance and display empathy and validation are less likely to experience disruptive behaviors in children and the clients they serve, and more able to implement effective interventions. So just some examples. How do we improve this? What do you want to see change? How do we get there? It becomes a reciprocal, a joint, a relational process, even with a 2-year-old. The empathy and validation piece, understanding the subjective experience, perspective taking. I understand this is really upsetting to you. You can't believe your sister had pancakes before you did. I know this is hard for you right now and your feelings are really hurt. I'll say that I came to this from a more professional line before it became personal, which is interesting. So we were doing a lot of work with direct care staff and really trying to find some of these strategies that would be effective for them. And we pulled in a lot of psychotherapy research piece that we had some experience with. And so we're training and training and training of staff. And I just was, I maybe did it a little bit with my kids before then, but I wasn't necessarily thinking of it. But then when I started really thinking about trying to kind of capture their experience, validate that, work from an alliance perspective, it's like, God, I didn't do this really before, and this can really be effective. It just didn't even enter my mind, so it was a strange kind of pathway to trying to implement that more so. It helps in when you have more than one child and there's fights. It helps in immediately capturing, well, you're upset at this, right? Because he or she's always doing that, and you're upset with this, and you become a better mediator because you're trying to do perspective taking of both at the same time, and too. So. Questions?
My question's actually about what you just talked about. You talked about basically it just maybe what they might be feeling and trying to understand. My daughter's 7, and I try to encourage her to use words, take breaths, and can you tell me why you're so upset? And so maybe if she's having so much struggling, should I be taking them and guessing, as you were? And then help her, and then as she gets better at controlling her emotions, then start asking her why she's feeling that. Like, how do I?
It's a really great point. So at what time do we, right? At what point across the spectrum of an event do we actually employ some of these interventions, whether it's empathy, validation, or support, or try to develop an alliance, or we start to implement some of our behaviorally oriented, that look, I really want to talk with you about this when you're able to show me control. Why don't you take 5 minutes, we'll come back to it. If you're not able to remember, these things are going to end up happening. I really don't want to see that happen, but I'm going to give you some time and let you make a choice, whatever that's going to be. I think that's the piece where the individual tailoring comes in, because truly children who have more neurobiological deficits, who once they're engaged, you don't pull them out. Like nothing will work in those moments. So it's more about, how do I help, manage around you for this, usually about 10 minutes. There's no talking to you. There's really nothing we can do other than just keep you safe, right? And then afterwards, like, yep, I understand you're really mad right now, but we're just going to try to create this safe space for you. And then, but I know in about 10 minutes, I might be able to get somewhere. And that's where the individual piece, because where some kids, as soon as this happens, are really upset, they can become dysregulated, but you can pull them out sometimes because what they're able to tolerate in that moment. So it depends.
Is there like a spectrum then for how invested you get? Because obviously, like if she's so out of control, then it's a timeout, and if she's very violent, then she has to go to her room.
Right.
And then oftentimes she'll come downstairs and say, "I was angry because of this." Which is great, but I want to teach her self-regulation,
right.
And so it does seem, at least with her, there is a spectrum, but I need tools.
Yeah.
And is there that? Is there a book for?
Well, there's so many.
Is there a good one.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, and at the risk of sounding self-promoting here, at our clinic, we have a parent training. I'm involved, but I don't help in facilitating it. And it runs twice a year. It's run by one of our staff psychologists, and it's actually a simultaneous parent group and child group. And actually, what is learned in the parent piece is applied to some of the things that are happening in the child group, and it's a really wonderful model. So you're learning all those really good skills and tools, but your child at the same time is learning self-regulation, social promotion, a lot of things within the group. And so I'm happy to, you can get my information, and I can give you information on that particular group as well. And there's similar groups at different agencies locally like that. I don't know if they do parent and child simultaneously like that, but there's lots of parent training groups.
The school district just did one like that last year. It was simultaneous. We took our ones out. It was really good stuff.
Great.
Yeah, about 7 or 8 groups.
It's a pretty amazing school district for the kinds of resources that they offer. Afterwards, too, you can get my email. You can look me up at Penn State. And if you had some specific questions or wanted to, I could come up with some names of books as well. If you were interested in some parent training types of, there's some really great books out there. Oh,
I'm just curious, since your daughter does a good chart.
yeah.
Same way in my house, my son loves the chart.
Yeah.
My daughter, we can clean out her room.
Right.
And she's type A personality, and she's very stressed out little kid, but yet when I do these things, it doesn't bother her.
Yeah.
But if she was to, which has never happened to her, get yelled at at school, if she did it,
Yeah.
her life would be over,
Right.
Yeah. But it's the struggle between me and her. What do you suggest then, what would get her attention?
It's
Really,
finding those things. I mean, my daughter, bedtime is a really sensitive topic for her, so please don't make me go to bed early, please. And for an incentive, can I stay up this much later if you're able to, do these things and show us that. And again, we just don't do it through a chart, in the same way, but bedtime, extra books. I mean, it's just finding the things for them that we really, like, I'll work toward for that. Yeah,
Get their attention.
exactly. Just might not be a chart. Okay.
What's the most efficient way for us to get the slides from you? And if you're going to have a sign-up sheet, or how do you want to handle it?
There's a sign-in sheet in the back, and if you put your contact information on there, everything from tonight will go out via email. If you need a hard copy, if you don't have email, you can put your address and we can send you a hard copy as well. And we'll also post this on our project's website, which we'll send to you as well.
Did you have?
Yeah, I kind of have, it's not really a direct, throw it out there and see if anyone else has the same problem. I seem to notice that my daughter, who's 9 now, tends to have more frequent outbursts, and they're more intense and longer lasting. When, upon retrospect, she's going through a developmental growth spurt. So, but of course, when you're caught up in it at the time, I can't sit there and go, oh, well, she's going through this huge developmental thing in her brain right now, and she's learning all these wonderful things, and that's where all the stress is happening. No, we're just caught up in a huge drama of
For being a pain.
her being, she's very right.
They can't hear anything that's going on in here.
And it's funny because it does reflect so much on my mood. If I find that I'm very calm and
Yeah.
I can deal with it, it may be as intense for her, it may be as intense for her and long lasting, but it doesn't seem to bother me as much, and I can help her kind of get through it without as much pain as much. But if I've had a tough day, I just can't take it. And I do the avoidance thing, I can tell you that right now. I just can't.
Yep.
I gotta leave the room for 5 minutes. But how can I be more consistent these things and realize these things are happening and start dealing with them yourself before they get too out of control. But,
Well, given your sensitivity and the way you ask the question, it just gives me a lot of hope in terms of you finding that, because so often we have a hard time even identifying that that's our challenge. So the fact that you're able to see that, the fact that you know that this is a dynamic, and I'm stressed, it's harder, so how do I pull myself away? I know I'm avoiding it. And just those things, sometimes it takes us so long to even get to a place where we're actually identifying that we do a lot of negative approach, negative avoidance, misattribution. So the answers I really don't, I couldn't say, but that's a huge piece in terms of moving forward.
and is it not just my observation, but is it normal that when kids are going through these like developmental growths,
Absolutely.
that their
Sure.
behavior is totally
Sure.
screwed up? My behavior is just totally.
Well, I want to make sure folks get out of here on time, so maybe one.
Well-
The person back here, that's right, you had a question.
If a child is taking a tantrum for X or Y reason, okay, and if he or she continuously says that she hates you, or he hates you,
Yeah.
you know, what the response should be about that? How can we talk to him about that particular sentence, you know,
Yeah.
I hate you?
Oh, yeah.
Or,
That's a pet peeve of mine, you know, like, when either of our kids actually use the word hate, you know, kind of respond, like, you know, what? I hate my homework, you know, like, oh, okay, because there's a lot of sensitivity, at least it's a norm in our household, we do not ever say that. Like, we don't say, I hate you, I hate my brother, I hate my sister, I hate you. And it's a chat, like, so it gets to how do we create norms in our home, like in terms of what's okay that we don't hit in our home, or we don't do these kinds of things. So one is we need to establish the norm for that kind of how we talk to each other, how we express our feelings. And then it's easier to establish, because I'm not saying actually that it's never happened either, but it's a lot easier for us to respond to because they know that they're stepping outside that norm. So then it's a matter of how do you have it established in terms of how do we talk to each other, how do we handle when we're upset, how do we say nice things to each other, right? So it's that incentives over punishment, all the positive things. However, when you cross that line and you tell your brother, sister, mom, dad, whatever, that I hate you, you know that that's a very serious thing, and these are the things that we've agreed upon are going to happen. And what those things are, you need to really talk that through. But so it's establishing the norm, that that's okay, or that's not okay. These are the things that are okay, and from here on out, we're not tolerating that anymore in this home.
in the right way now. I mean, I explained to him that I love him, that I don't hate him, you know, that I understand that he's upset, you know, but I don't want that kind of vocabulary in the house. So he said, okay, I'll try not to do it again, you know, so. But I was just wondering if I came with the correct way.
It's good to know, for them to know too, if that does happen again and you're not able to control yourself, what happens? And then it's important for us to, whatever we set up, that we're consistent with that we support each other. If there's multiple parents in the home, there's a lot of pieces that have to go into them, what that looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Well, my question was answered. It was just about the developmental growth spurts, and because I feel like my kids have the tool sets and then they regress and forget the tool sets, and so I get frustrated because I think you know how to react to this, respond to this. So,
We are just after 8, so if you have any questions, Mike, I don't know if you're willing to stick around for a few minutes. You can be available, but I do want to hold everybody up. I do want to thank everyone for coming. This is such a fantastic turnout. And again, for those of you that I saw just a couple weeks ago, welcome back. And I hope that all of you are able to come in March. Mike's colleague, Brian Rabian, will be presenting on stress and anxiety. And so, again, come back in March, keep coming and seeing us, and we'll send you all the information out via email. But again, if you need a hard copy, please leave your address in the back. And thanks again to Leslie and Jess, my super staff in the back.